Thousands of years ago, a prophet wrote something that seemed impossible. He said one specific nation would never cease to exist. Not as long as the sun rises, not as long as the oceans move, not as long as the stars remain in the sky. At the time, that nation was surrounded by enemies and on the edge of collapse. But here is what makes this extraordinary. Every single word of that prophecy has held true. Through genocides, through exile, through 2,000 years of having no homeland, that nation is Israel. And what was written about its future should stop you in your tracks, because this is not a story about politics. It is not about military power, and it is not about luck. This is a story about a promise that no empire, no army, and no force in history has ever been able to break. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly why Israel will never be destroyed. Here is where the story begins. Not in 1948, not in World War II, not even in the Middle Ages. It begins with one man, standing alone, in the middle of nowhere, and a voice that would change the course of human history forever. His name was Abraham, and what God said to him thousands of years ago is still shaping world events today. Think about that for a moment. A conversation that happened in the ancient Middle East is still the reason why headlines about Israel appear in your newsfeed every single day. But before we get to what was said, here is something most people overlook entirely. Abraham was not Jewish. He was not born into a religious tradition. He was not a priest or a prophet. He was a man from a city called Ur, in what is now modern-day Iraq, living among people who worshipped multiple gods. And yet, God chose him, not because of who Abraham was, but because of what God had already decided to do through him. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Because if this covenant, this promise, was based on Abraham's perfection or his people's behavior, it would have collapsed 1,000 times over. But it was not based on that. And that is exactly why it is still standing. So what was the promise? God told Abraham 3 things that seemed completely impossible at the time. First, that his descendants would become a great nation. This was remarkable because Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. Sarah was well past the age of having children. By every human measure, this promise made no sense. Second, that his descendants would be given a specific piece of land, a territory that would belong to them as a permanent inheritance, not temporarily, not conditionally, permanently. Third, that through Abraham's descendants, every nation on earth would ultimately be blessed. 3 promises, all of them impossible by human standards. And here is the part that should make you pause. How every single one of them has come to pass. Now Abraham had 2 sons, and this is where the story gets complicated. His first son was Ishmael, born to an Egyptian woman named Hagar, who served in Abraham's household. Ishmael was the firstborn, and in the ancient world, the firstborn received everything. But God made clear that the covenant, the specific promise about the nation and the land, would continue through Abraham's second son, Isaac, born to Sarah, born against every natural possibility, born as living proof that when God makes a promise, no biological barrier can stop it. Now it is important to say something here clearly. This does not mean Ishmael was forgotten or unloved. The historical record shows that God also promised to bless Ishmael and make him into a great people. Many scholars connect Ishmael to the Arab peoples. Though historians note this connection involves complex genealogical history that cannot be traced with complete precision. But the specific covenant about the nation of Israel, the land, the identity, the prophetic destiny that passed through Isaac, and then through Isaac's son Jacob. And Jacob was the man God renamed Israel. 12 sons came from Jacob, 12 tribes, 1 people, 1 name, Israel. Now, here is something that gets missed in most conversations about this topic. And this covenant was not a contract between 2 equal parties. In the ancient world, covenants worked in different ways. Some required both sides to fulfill obligations for the agreement to hold. But the covenant God made with Abraham was different. It was what biblical scholars call an unconditional covenant. God essentially said, I am making this promise, and I alone will fulfill it. Your failure will not cancel it. Your disobedience will not erase it. Your worst moments will not void it. Well, that is an extraordinary kind of promise. And it explains something that has confused people for centuries. How could a people who have faced so much punishment, exile, persecution, displacement, still be described as a people with a divine destiny? The answer is in the nature of the covenant itself. God never said they would be exempt from consequences. He said they would never be destroyed. There is a significant difference between those two things. Discipline is not abandonment. Suffering is not cancellation. And this raises a question that takes us into the darkest chapters of history. If God made this promise, if this covenant is unbreakable, if Israel's existence is guaranteed by the word of the Creator himself, then why have so many powerful empires come so terrifyingly close to wiping them out? Why did God allow his own people to be enslaved, scattered, and nearly exterminated repeatedly across thousands of years? That answer is coming, and it is more sobering than most people expect. Every empire has a moment when it believes it is unstoppable, a moment when its armies are so large, its walls so high, and its power so absolute that the idea of falling seems laughable. Egypt felt that way. Babylon felt that way. Rome felt that way. And every single one of them directed that power, at least in part, toward one goal: eliminating Israel. What happened next is one of the most remarkable patterns in all of recorded history. Not one of them succeeded, and not one of them survived intact either. Let's start with Egypt. At the height of its power, Egypt was the most dominant civilization on earth. Its pharaohs were considered gods. Its armies were feared across the known world. Its resources were unmatched, and the people of Israel were its slaves. For generations, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived under brutal forced labor in Egypt. The historical and biblical record describes a people crushed under the weight of one of the most powerful empires ever known. And then Pharaoh made a decision that sealed Egypt's fate. Fearing the growing population of the Hebrew people, he ordered the killing of every newborn Hebrew boy. Every single one. It was a calculated attempt to reduce a people down to nothing, to cut off the next generation before it could grow. But one boy survived. He was placed in a basket on the Nile River by a mother who refused to let her son die. And that boy was pulled from the water by Pharaoh's own daughter, raised inside the very palace that had ordered his death. His name was Moses, and the man Pharaoh tried to destroy became the man God used to dismantle the entire Egyptian empire through a series of events that Egypt's own historical records struggle to explain. Israel walked out of Egypt, and Egypt was never the same again. But freedom did not mean safety. Centuries later, a new threat rose from the north: Assyria. The Assyrian Empire was known across the ancient world for one thing above everything else: absolute brutality. Their military campaigns were designed not just to defeat enemies, but to psychologically break them. They relocated entire populations, destroyed cities, and made examples of those who resisted. They came for the northern kingdom of Israel, and they succeeded in taking it captive. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel were scattered, displaced, absorbed into foreign lands. On the surface, it looked like the end. But here is what Assyria did not count on. The covenant did not travel with armies. It did not depend on borders or buildings or military strength. It traveled with the people. A remnant remained. The identity survived. The promise held. And Assyria, that empire of terror that shook the ancient world, collapsed within roughly a century of its peak power. Historians mark its fall around 609 BC, though the exact timeline of its decline involved several stages. Israel outlasted it. Then came Babylon. If Assyria was brutal, Babylon was theatrical about its power. King Nebuchadnezzar marched against Jerusalem, destroyed the temple that had stood as the heart of Israel's identity, burned the city, and took the people into captivity. It was devastating in a way that went beyond physical destruction. The temple was not just a building, and it was the place where heaven and earth met for the Jewish people. Its destruction felt like an announcement that God had abandoned them completely. And yet, even in Babylon, something remarkable happened. Prophets continued to speak. Faith continued to burn. The identity of the people remained intact, even in a foreign land surrounded by a foreign culture. And then something happened that no political analyst of that era would have predicted. A prophet named Jeremiah, writing before the exile even ended, announced that after exactly 70 years, the people would return. 70 years. He gave a specific number. And when the Persian Empire rose and conquered Babylon, the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jewish people to return to their land. Historians generally date this decree to around 538 BC, and the timeline aligns remarkably closely with the 70-year period Jeremiah described. Though scholars continue to discuss the precise calculation, what is not debated is this: they went back, Babylon fell, Israel returned. But the threats did not stop there. During the Persian period, a man named Haman rose to a position of significant power in the royal court, and he developed a consuming hatred for the Jewish people. He devised a plan, with royal backing, to have every Jewish person in the Persian Empire killed on a specific day. It was one of the earliest recorded attempts at what we would today call ethnically targeted persecution on a governmental scale. The order was signed. The date was set. The machinery of destruction was in motion. And then, an ordinary woman did an extraordinary thing. A Jewish woman named Esther, who had kept her identity hidden inside the royal palace, and made a decision that could have cost her life. She revealed who she was. She appealed to the king, and the entire plan collapsed. Haman was removed from power and held accountable for what he had plotted. The Jewish people were spared, and the Feast of Purim, still observed by Jewish communities around the world today, marks that moment of reversal every year. Then came the Greeks, specifically a ruler named Antiochus IV, who governed the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BC. He did not just want to defeat the Jewish people. He wanted to erase their identity entirely. He desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. He outlawed the observance of Jewish law. He made practicing the faith a crime punishable by death. It was a cultural and spiritual assault designed to break a people from the inside out. But a family of priests, known as the Maccabees, refused to comply. They launched a resistance against a far larger and better equipped force, and against the odds, they reclaimed the temple. The Jewish festival of Hanukkah, observed every year to this day, is the celebration of that moment. The temple was rededicated, the light was restored, and then Rome arrived. In 70 AD, Roman forces under General Titus besieged Jerusalem. The city fell. The Second Temple was destroyed. The Jewish people were scattered across the known world in what became one of the longest and most painful periods of displacement in human history. The Roman Emperor Hadrian later attempted to erase the very name of the land, renaming it and banning Jewish presence in Jerusalem entirely. It looked, by every human measure, like the final chapter, a people without a land, without a temple, without a government, scattered across every continent for nearly 2,000 years. And here is the question that should be sitting with you right now. How does a people survive that? How does any group of human beings hold on to an identity, a language, a faith, a sense of collective destiny for 2,000 years without a homeland? No other people in recorded history has done it, not one. And what happened next, in the 20th century, is either the greatest coincidence in modern history, or it is exactly what the prophet said would happen, because what came before that return is something that still shakes the conscience of the entire world. There are moments in history that are so dark, so painful, that words feel inadequate. What happened in Europe between 1933 and 1945 is one of those moments, and it is impossible to tell the story of Israel's survival without standing in the weight of it. Because what the Nazi regime attempted was not just a war, it was a systematic, government-organized effort to eliminate every Jewish man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. Not to defeat them, not to displace them, and to erase them completely. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany in 1933. From the very beginning, his ideology placed the Jewish people at the center of a hatred so consuming, so methodically organized, that historians still study how an entire modern nation was mobilized behind it. Within years, laws were passed stripping Jewish citizens of their rights. Their businesses were targeted, their homes were marked. Their children were removed from schools, step by step. A people who had lived inside European society for generations were systematically pushed to the margins. And then the margins disappeared entirely. What followed is known today as the Holocaust. Approximately 6 million Jewish people were murdered between 1941 and 1945. This figure is drawn from extensive post-war documentation, census records, and the findings of the Nuremberg trials. Historians consider it one of the most thoroughly documented atrocities in human history. Men, elderly people, and children were transported in packed freight cars to concentration and extermination camps across German-occupied Europe. Places like Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland became centers of systematic killing on a scale the world had never seen. Entire communities, towns where Jewish families had lived for centuries, were emptied. Entire family lines were cut off in a single night. Now, pause here for a moment, because this is the part of the story where the opposition to Israel came closer than at any point in history to achieving what every previous empire had failed to do. At the peak of Nazi-occupied Europe, the Jewish population of the continent had been reduced by approximately 2/3, according to post-war demographic studies. 2/3. Communities that had existed for 1,000 years, gone. Languages, traditions, knowledge, and culture buried. And the world largely looked away till it was almost too late. From a purely human perspective, this looked like it could be the end, not a defeat. Not an exile, something far worse. But here is where the story turns. And this turn is so sharp, so sudden, and so improbable that it demands an explanation that goes beyond politics and military strategy. On May 14th, 1948, just 3 years after the liberation of the concentration camps, the State of Israel was declared. 3 years. A people who had just emerged from the worst human catastrophe of the 20th century stood up and declared themselves a nation on land that had been their ancestral homeland for thousands of years. In a language, Hebrew, that had been kept alive primarily through religious texts and had not been spoken as an everyday national language for roughly 2,000 years. Think about what that means. A language that most linguists would have classified as ancient and ceremonial was revived and became the official living language of a modern nation-state. There is no comparable example of a dormant language being successfully revived as a national spoken language in modern history. Scholars who study language revival point to Hebrew as a singular case, but the Declaration of Independence did not bring peace. It brought war. Within hours of Israel declaring statehood, 5 neighboring nations launched a coordinated military attack. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq moved against a people who had no formal standing army, no established military infrastructure, and had just survived one of history's worst tragedies. By every conventional military assessment, Israel should not have survived that conflict. The combined population and military resources of the attacking nations vastly outnumbered the newly declared state, Bargiman. And yet the war ended with Israel not only surviving, but holding more territory than the original partition plan had allocated to it. Military historians have analyzed this conflict extensively. Some point to strategic decisions, internal divisions among the attacking forces, and the motivation of a people fighting for survival. Others note factors that fall outside standard military analysis. What is agreed upon is the outcome. Israel survived. Now, here is what most people do not know about that moment. The prophet Ezekiel, writing approximately 2,500 years before 1948, described a vision of a valley filled with dry bones, dead, scattered, disconnected. And in that vision, God asked him a question: can these bones live? And then breath came into them. They reconnected. They rose. Ezekiel was told plainly that this vision represented the house of Israel, that God would bring his people back from the nations where they had been scattered, that he would return them to their own land. That vision was written during the Babylonian exile, when Israel had already lost its land once. But the scale of what Ezekiel described, a gathering from all nations, a restoration of national life, points to something far larger than just the return from Babylon. And in 1948, Jewish people began returning to Israel from Europe, from the Middle East, from North Africa, from every direction. The dry bones were rising. But here is what nobody talks about enough. The rebirth of Israel was not the end of the threat. It was the beginning of a new chapter in a very old story. Because the nations that attacked in 1948 did not accept the outcome. And 19 years later, the same region would erupt again in a conflict so short and so decisive that military analysts still study it today as one of the most extraordinary events in modern warfare. What happened in those 6 days in 1967 changed the map of the Middle East permanently, and the biblical significance of what Israel recovered during those 6 days is something that students of prophecy have been talking about ever since. 6 days. That is all it took. In June of 1967, Israel found itself once again surrounded by neighboring states, mobilizing for war. Egypt had closed a key international waterway to Israeli shipping. Our forces were positioned along Israel's borders from multiple directions. The situation pointed toward one outcome, another attempt to end Israel's existence. Israeli military leadership made a decision that military historians still debate today. Rather than wait to absorb the first strike, Israel launched a preemptive military operation. What followed over the next 6 days reshaped the entire Middle East. By the time the fighting stopped, Israel had gained control of the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and, most significantly to students of biblical prophecy, East Jerusalem, including the Old City, including the Western Wall, the last remaining structure connected to the ancient temple complex that had been destroyed by Rome nearly 2,000 years earlier. For the first time since 70 AD, Jerusalem was under Jewish governance. Israeli soldiers who reached the Western Wall that day were documented on film and in written accounts as overcome with emotion, because they understood the weight of what had just happened. Something that generations of Jewish people across 2,000 years had prayed toward, facing Jerusalem, had just become reality. Now here is where the story moves from history into something that should make every thoughtful person stop and think carefully. After 1967, a summit was held in Khartoum, in Sudan, where representatives of Arab states issued what became known as the 3 no's. No recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel. It was a formal, collective rejection of Israel's right to exist. And yet, 11 years later, something happened that the Khartoum Declaration said was impossible. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed a peace agreement. Egypt became the first Arab nation to formally recognize Israel as a state. As part of the agreement, Israel returned the entire Sinai Peninsula, a significant territorial concession, in exchange for that recognition. It was a crack in what had seemed like an unbreakable wall of regional hostility, and it demonstrated something important. Israel had shown it was willing to make painful concessions when a genuine offer of peace was on the table. That willingness was tested again in the year 2000 at negotiations held at Camp David under American mediation. Once Israeli leadership put forward a proposal that many observers described as a significant and far-reaching offer in the context of that conflict. The details of exactly what was offered remain a subject of debate among historians and political analysts. But most accounts agree that the proposal included Palestinian governance over a significant portion of the disputed territories and a framework for addressing Jerusalem. The talks broke down, and in the months that followed, a wave of attacks inside Israel claimed the lives of hundreds of civilians in public spaces. The pattern that had repeated across thousands of years was repeating again in the modern era. Every time the door to peace opened, something slammed it shut. But here is what makes the modern chapter of this story unlike anything that came before it. The challenges Israel faces today are not just from neighboring states with conventional armies, but Iran, a nation of significant regional influence, has stated through its leadership on multiple occasions that it does not recognize Israel's right to exist. Its government has funded and supported armed groups operating on multiple of Israel's borders simultaneously. Organizations operating out of Lebanon and Gaza have launched thousands of rockets into Israeli civilian areas over the past 2 decades. Figures are documented by United Nations monitoring bodies and government records, although numbers vary depending on the time period measured. Israel today faces a security environment that no nation of its size faces anywhere else on Earth. A country roughly the size of the state of New Jersey, facing active hostility on multiple fronts simultaneously. And then came October 7th, 2023. On that morning, a large-scale attack was launched from Gaza into southern Israel. Multiple international news organizations and government statements documented it as the deadliest single day for Jewish people in decades. The attack shocked the world, and it ignited a conflict whose full consequences are still unfolding. But here is what that day did not do. It did not destroy Israel. Now step back from the headlines for a moment. Look at the full picture. Ancient empires, medieval persecutions, a 20th century genocide, 5 invading armies in 1948, a 6-day war in 1967, decades of rocket attacks, and one of the most devastating single-day attacks in modern Israeli history in 2023. And Israel is still here, still functioning, still developing, still standing. A nation that by the late 2000s had become a recognized contributor to global innovation in areas including water technology, agricultural science, and cybersecurity, according to multiple international development indexes, despite spending a significant portion of its national budget on defense every single year. That combination, constant external pressure and internal growth, has no real parallel in modern geopolitics. So how do you explain it? Military strategy only goes so far. Alliance structures only go so far. National resilience only goes so far. At some point, the honest observer has to ask a question that goes deeper than politics, because it turns out, thousands of years before any of this happened, specific things were written down about Israel's future, not vague spiritual sentiments, specific, detailed, verifiable statements about what would happen to this nation. And when you lay those ancient writings next to the modern headlines, the alignment is something that is very difficult to dismiss. What was written, what was promised, and then what has actually happened. That is exactly where this story goes next. And what the ancient prophets said about Israel's future goes far beyond anything that has happened yet. Here is a question worth sitting with. What would it take for you to believe that a book written thousands of years ago actually predicted the future, not in vague, symbolic language that could mean anything, but in specific, concrete, verifiable terms? Because that is exactly what we are about to look at. Now, when the evidence does not ask you to abandon your reason, it asks you to use it. Let's start with something written by a prophet named Jeremiah. Jeremiah lived and wrote during one of the darkest periods in Israel's history. Jerusalem was about to fall. The temple was about to be destroyed. The people were about to be carried into exile in Babylon. Everything pointed toward the end of Israel as a nation. And in that moment, at the lowest possible point, Jeremiah wrote something extraordinary. He wrote that God had declared Israel would remain a nation for as long as the sun gives light during the day and the moon and stars give light at night, for as long as the ocean moves and its waves make sound. In other words, for as long as the natural order of the universe holds together. And then he went further. He wrote that the only way God would reject Israel entirely is if someone could first measure the full expanse of the heavens above or explore every foundation beneath the earth, both of which, even with every tool modern science possesses today, remain impossible. The observable universe is estimated by astronomers to be approximately 93 billion light-years in diameter, and the deepest humans have ever drilled into the Earth's crust, the Kola super-deep borehole in Russia, reached just over 12 kilometers before the project was abandoned due to extreme heat and pressure. The foundations of the Earth remain unexplored. The heavens remain unmeasured. And Israel remains a nation. Now consider what the prophet Ezekiel wrote. Ezekiel wrote during the Babylonian exile, a period when Israel had no land, no temple, and no political existence. He described God speaking directly about the future of his scattered people. God declared through Ezekiel that he would personally gather the Jewish people from every nation where they had been scattered and bring them back to their own land. Not some of them, from every direction, from every nation. At the time Ezekiel wrote this, the Jewish people had been displaced to Babylon, but the language he used went far beyond a simple return from one captivity. He described a global regathering, a restoration of national life, a people returning from every corner of the earth to one specific land. Between 1948 and the present day, Jewish people have immigrated to Israel from over 100 countries, according to records maintained by the Jewish Agency for Israel, an organization that has tracked immigration patterns since before Israeli statehood, from Ethiopia, from Yemen, from the former Soviet Union, from Argentina, from France, from the United States, every continent, every direction, returning to one land. Then there is the prophet Amos, writing in the 8th century BC, a period historians generally place around 760 to 750 BC, though some scholarly debate exists around exact dating. Amos recorded a declaration from God about Israel's future. God said he would restore his people, that they would rebuild what had been ruined, that they would plant and harvest in their own land. And then, this is the part that stands out, that he would plant them in their land, and they would never again be removed from it, never again removed. After everything that had happened, after every exile, after every displacement, a permanent return was promised. And what makes that statement remarkable is the timing of when Amos wrote it. He wrote it before the Assyrian conquest, before the Babylonian exile, before the Roman diaspora, before 2,000 years of living without a homeland. He wrote it before all of that, and still declared a permanent return. Now, here is where the biblical picture becomes something that is genuinely difficult to explain away. These were not three isolated writers sharing a common cultural hope. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos wrote in different centuries, in different circumstances, addressing different immediate crises, and yet their declarations about Israel's future align with each other and with what actually happened in the 20th century, with a consistency that goes beyond coincidence. A people scattered, a people preserved, a people returned, a nation reborn, written down centuries in advance. But there is another dimension to the biblical picture of Israel that goes beyond the physical restoration of the nation. And this is the part that most news coverage, and even most casual Bible readers, tends to overlook. The prophets were not just describing a political return. They were describing a spiritual journey. And that journey, according to the biblical record, is not yet complete. And the Apostle Paul, writing in the 1st century to the early church in Rome, addressed this directly. He described what he called a mystery, something that had not been fully understood before. He explained that Israel had experienced a partial hardening, a spiritual condition in which most of the Jewish people would not recognize Jesus as their Messiah, and that this hardening would last for a specific season, until a certain fullness had been reached among the non-Jewish nations of the world. And then, after that, something would shift. Paul declared that all Israel would be saved. He was not speaking symbolically. In the context of everything he had written in the surrounding chapters, he was speaking about the Jewish people as a nation experiencing a future moment of national spiritual awakening, a turning, a recognition, a restoration. Was and the prophet Zechariah described what that moment would look like. He wrote that God would pour out a spirit of deep prayer and grace upon the people of Jerusalem, and that in that moment, they would look upon the one they had pierced, and they would grieve deeply, like someone grieving the loss of a firstborn child. The language Zechariah used, the one they pierced, is language that the New Testament directly connects to Jesus Christ. And the Gospel of John references this passage in the context of the crucifixion. What Zechariah described is a future moment of national recognition, a day when the Jewish people, as a nation, will see clearly who Jesus is, and the one who was rejected will be the one who receives them. Now hold all of that together for a moment. Physical promises about the land fulfilled, promises about regathering from every nation happening in real time, and promises about permanent restoration declared before every major exile, and promises about a future spiritual awakening still ahead. The biblical narrative about Israel is not a story that ended in the past. It is a story that is still moving, still unfolding, with a final chapter that, according to every prophet who wrote about it, will be the most significant of all. Because what the Bible says is coming for Israel involves not just one nation, but every nation on earth. And in the events that lead to that final chapter may already be in motion. Everything covered so far has been about what already happened, the empires that fell, the exiles that ended, the nation that came back. But the biblical record does not stop at 1948. It does not stop at the Six-Day War. It does not stop at any moment in modern history. According to the prophets, the most significant events in Israel's story have not happened yet. And what they described, written thousands of years ago, reads less like ancient poetry and more like a detailed outline of what is still ahead. The prophet Zechariah, who we looked at briefly in the last section, wrote extensively about a specific period he described as the day of the Lord. He described a time when every nation on earth would be gathered against Jerusalem. Not some nations, not a regional coalition, every nation. He described the city being surrounded, the severe hardship falling upon its inhabitants, a situation so desperate that by every human calculation, survival would seem impossible. Now, it is important to be clear here. Biblical scholars hold different views on the precise timeline and interpretation of these events. Some see them as describing events that have already occurred in history. Some others, and this represents a significant body of scholarship within evangelical and prophetic traditions, understand Zechariah to be describing events that are still future. What is consistent across those interpretations is this: when the situation reaches its most desperate point, God Himself intervenes. Zechariah described God going out to fight against the nations that have gathered against Jerusalem, not through a human army, not through a political alliance, directly. And he described something even more specific. He wrote that, in that moment, feet would stand on the Mount of Olives, the hill directly east of Jerusalem, and that the mountain itself would split in two, creating a large valley running east and west. The Mount of Olives is a real geographical location. It sits at approximately 826 meters above sea level, according to geographic surveys. It overlooks the old city of Jerusalem directly, and the New Testament records that it is the exact location from which Jesus ascended into heaven following His resurrection. The book of Acts records that as Jesus ascended, those present were told He would return in the same way they had seen Him go. Same location, same manner. Zechariah wrote about feet standing on that mountain, centuries before Jesus ever walked on it. Now consider what that return means for Israel specifically. It is not just a global event. It is a deeply personal one for the Jewish people. Remember what Zechariah wrote about the Spirit of grace being poured out, about Israel looking upon the one they pierced, about a grief as deep as losing a firstborn child. That moment of national recognition, that spiritual awakening, is connected in the prophetic timeline to the return of the Messiah. It is the moment when what Paul described in Romans, the salvation of all Israel, becomes reality, not a theological concept, not a future hope held at arm's length, a moment, a day, a turning point that every prophet who touched this subject pointed toward. And what follows that moment, according to the prophet Isaiah and confirmed by Micah writing independently, is something that stands in complete contrast to everything the world has known up to that point. Isaiah described a future era in which Jerusalem becomes the center of something the world has never seen, a place where nations come, not to make war, but to seek truth and understanding, where the instruments of conflict are set aside in favor of building and cultivating, where the knowledge of God covers the earth and the way water covers the ocean floor. Micah, writing in a different century from Isaiah, describe the same scene with remarkable consistency. Nations streaming toward Jerusalem, conflicts resolved, peace established not through human diplomacy, but through divine governance. Two prophets, different centuries, same picture. Now here is what all of this means when you pull back and look at the full scope of Israel's story. From Abraham to Moses, from Moses to the exile, from the exile to the return, from the return to the diaspora, from the diaspora to 1948, from 1948 to today. Every chapter has followed the same pattern: threat, preservation, restoration, threat, preservation, restoration, over and over again. Not because Israel has been perfect. The biblical record makes clear that it has not. Not because the world has been kind to them. History makes clear that it has not. But because a covenant made thousands of years ago has proven, through every empire, every tragedy, every war, and every generation, to be unbreakable. So when you look at the headlines today, when you see Israel surrounded by hostility on multiple fronts, when you hear voices from multiple directions challenging its right to exist, and when the pressure on this small nation seems to be building from every side simultaneously, the biblical picture does not say, "Be afraid." It says, "Pay attention," because what the prophets described as the build-up to the final chapter of Israel's story looks a great deal like what is happening right now. And if the prophets were right about everything that has already occurred, the question every honest observer has to ask is this: what does that mean for what they said is still coming? Because there is one final piece of this story, one dimension of Israel's future that ties every thread together. And it does not just affect Israel. It affects every single person alive on earth today. That is where this ends. And it may be the most important thing you hear in this entire video. Here is what this entire story comes down to. Every empire that targeted Israel is gone. Every ideology that sought to erase it has collapsed. Every military coalition that surrounded it has either fallen apart or been turned back. And Israel is still here, not just surviving, functioning, building, growing, in the middle of a region that has never stopped challenging its right to exist. Now here is the part that changes everything. This is not just Israel's story. It never was. Because the covenant God made with Abraham did not end with one nation on one piece of land in the Middle East. It ended with a promise that through Abraham's descendants, every nation on earth would be blessed. That promise has a name, and that name, according to the New Testament, according to the prophets, and according to the testimony of millions across 2,000 years of history, is Jesus Christ. Born into the line of Abraham, born into the tribe of Judah, born in the land of Israel. The blessing that was promised to every nation came through the nation that the world has spent thousands of years trying to destroy. Think about that. The same people who were enslaved in Egypt, the same people who were carried into Babylon, the same people who were scattered by Rome, the same people who survived the 20th century's darkest chapter, the same people who declared statehood in 1948 with 5 armies at their border. Those same people were the ones through whom the hope of the entire world arrived. That is not a coincidence. That is a covenant playing out exactly as it was written. So what does this mean for you personally? If the prophets were right about the exile, and they were. If they were right about the return, and they were. If they were right about the regathering from every nation, and that is happening right now, then the parts of the prophetic picture that have not yet occurred deserve serious attention. The gathering of nations, the darkest hour, the divine intervention, the national awakening of Israel, the return of the one they pierced. These are not distant theological ideas, and they are the next chapters of a story that has proven, across thousands of years and against every human expectation, to be exactly what it claims to be. Israel will not be destroyed, not because of its military, not because of its alliances, not because of international support, but because the one who made the promise has never broken one, not once, in all of recorded history, not once. But here is what most people who study Israel's past never think to ask. If God preserved Israel through everything it has already faced, what is He actually preserving it for? What is the purpose behind the preservation? What happens on the other side of all of this? Because the prophets did not just describe Israel surviving, they described what comes after, and what comes after is something that no nation, no government, and no human system has ever been able to build. That is the next conversation. And it begins with a question that has been sitting in the pages of Scripture for thousands of years, waiting for exactly this moment in history to be asked.